The origins of the Cold War can be traced back to the complex and uneasy alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II. Although these two superpowers joined forces to defeat Nazi Germany, their ideological differences and mutual suspicions began to surface even before the war had ended. The United States, a capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union, a communist dictatorship, were driven by fundamentally different visions for the post-war world, setting the stage for a prolonged period of geopolitical tension, known as the Cold War. One of the first significant points of contention between the United States and the Soviet Union emerged with the development of the atomic bomb. The United States had initiated the Manhattan Project in 1942, a top-secret program to develop nuclear weapons, with the aim of ending the war swiftly and decisively. As the project progressed, the US government made a conscious decision to keep the development of the bomb a secret, not only from their enemies, but also from their Soviet allies. This decision was fueled by growing distrust of the Soviet Union, as American leaders were increasingly wary of Joseph Stalin's post-war ambitions in Europe and beyond. The atomic bomb was successfully tested in July 1945 in what became known as the Trinity Test in New Mexico. Shortly thereafter, the United States used atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's surrender and the end of World War II. The fact that the United States had developed such a powerful weapon without Soviet knowledge further strained the already tenuous relationship between the two countries. Stalin, who had been kept in the dark about the project despite the wartime alliance, interpreted this as a direct threat to Soviet security and an indication of the United States' intention to assert global dominance. Meanwhile, as the war in Europe drew to a close, the Soviet Union began to establish its influence over Eastern Europe. The Red Army, having borne the brunt of the fight against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, occupied much of Eastern Europe as they pushed the Germans back towards Berlin. Stalin viewed these territories as both a buffer zone to protect the Soviet Union from future invasions and an area where Soviet influence could be expanded. As a result, the Soviet Union began installing communist governments in the countries it occupied, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These governments, while ostensibly independent, were heavily influenced and controlled by Moscow, effectively turning Eastern Europe into a sphere of Soviet influence. This expansion of Soviet control in Eastern Europe was deeply alarming to the United States and its Western European allies. They saw the spread of communism as a direct threat to the stability and freedom of Europe. Winston Churchill, the former British Prime Minister, famously described this division of Europe in a speech in Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946. He declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, dividing the free democratic nations of the West from the communist-controlled countries in the East. This metaphorical iron curtain represented the ideological and physical boundary between the two opposing blocs, marking the beginning of a divided Europe that would persist throughout the Cold War. The Iron Curtain was not merely a symbolic divide, but also a very real and tangible one. In the years following the end of World War II, this divide became more pronounced as the Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, suppressing any opposition to communist rule and isolating the region from the West. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, would later become the most infamous symbol of this division, physically separating East and West Berlin, and by extension, the entire Eastern Bloc from Western Europe. In response to the growing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, the United States adopted a policy of containment, aimed at preventing the further spread of communism. This policy was articulated by American diplomat George Kennan in his Long Telegram, and later in an article in Foreign Affairs, where he argued that the Soviet Union's expansionist tendencies needed to be countered through a combination of military, economic, and diplomatic strategies. The United States began to form alliances, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949, to unite Western nations against the perceived threat of Soviet aggression. Thus, the origins of the Cold War can be traced to a combination of mutual distrust, conflicting ideologies, and the actions of both superpowers in the aftermath of World War II. The United States' decision to keep the development of the atomic bomb a secret, coupled with the Soviet Union's expansion into Eastern Europe, created a climate of suspicion and hostility that would define global politics for the next several decades. The Iron Curtain became a stark reminder of the deep divisions that had emerged between East and West, as the world settled into a tense and often dangerous standoff that would only begin to thaw with the end of the Cold War in 1991.